Welcome as we go exploring the world of Pokemon. Today's story, Two Sides of the Same Bear. In our last story, we finished with the discovery of white-striped basculin and basculegion, as this species was no longer to be extinct. However, this was not the end of the story when it came to the Pokedex that was found, as when the natives of the Kitakami region were shown, they did pick out another Pokemon, believe it or not, from the Pokedex that they had seen. After a discussion with some of the locals and local professors and scientists, were able to gather information that the Pokemon that the natives had chosen out was actually Ursaluna, a Pokemon long thought to be either extant or extinct and very, very hard to find, as they show up randomly in the Pokemon world or are very hard to find. However, it was discovered as there was one who was prominently found in the Kitakami region. However, as the researchers and scientists discussed with the locals, they were able to sketch a design for the Pokemon that they were seeing. However, they were shocked, as a lot of the depictions that they were getting was not like the depiction in the book, as the creature that they were able to draw seemed to have morphological differences from the Pokemon that was in the Pokedex, as what they were getting was something completely different than what was expected. And to their surprise, a picture was even produced of what this Pokemon was supposed to be, as there are some scant pictures of people encountering this Pokemon. More importantly, the natives have a rich history with it. And this would lead scientists down a rabbit hole to understand the importance and also the very different appearance of Ursaluna, as this was no simple bear missing to be refound, as this Pokemon was very, very important and played a role in the history of Pokemon. In order to start today's story, we must travel to the woodlands of Johto, where we find Ursaring and Teddiursa, the evolutionary species for Ursaluna, and more importantly, the link to this ancient bear. Now, to many, it's actually a surprise that Ursaring at all would need an evolution, as the Pokemon is pretty burly, strong, and is successful in many areas of the Pokemon world. And Teddiursa itself is beloved by many people for pets, as well as being kept as a Pokemon for eventual battlers and trainers, as Ursaring are very fierce. As stories talk about Ursarings being very detrimental to villages, as they would raid storerooms in search of food, but more importantly, in a fury, they could destroy entire villages if they were made mad. So, when many believed that Ursaring wouldn't need an evolution, it was actually a shock to believe that Ursaring's evolution wasn't complete, and we would actually have even more of an interesting story figuring out what the evolution was used for, as we would venture back to Sinnoh in order to find these pieces of knowledge. However, going back even further to history, we could find the amazing Ursaluna, as the primitive Pokedex actually had some nuggets of information for us, as we would look in at the dex entry, as it reads as follows. I believe it was Hisui's swampy terrain that gave Ursaluna its burly physique and newfound capacity to manipulate peat at will. Now, many scientists were actually flabbergasted at this, as the first word that popped out of their head was peat, as peat isn't something that would be normally associated with the Ursaring and Teddiursa line, but in this case was very important to Ursaluna. Now, for those who don't know what peat is, I will give a quick description. As peat is an accumulation of partially decayed vegetation or organic matter. It is unique to natural areas called peatlands, bogs, mires, moors, and etc. areas that contain peat. And for the aforementioned Crimson Mire lands, this was prominent, as this was actually the location where Ursaluna was found in the Hisui region. However, this did not mean that it was still a question of doubt whether this peat actually made a difference in the lives of Teddiursa and Ursaring, as by the book's depiction, Ursaring and Teddiursa were prominent in the Crimson Mirelands as well, and in wide numbers. More importantly than that, we also find the presence of alpha Pokemon, and noted in the book Alpha Ursarings, which means that there was a very powerful and double the size Pokemon than the normal standard size of what would be found in the modern day. So with this high number of Pokemon, why on earth would there'd be a need for Ursaluna, as obviously it proves and shows that Ursaring itself could hold its own. However, this did not go unknown and unchecked, as we do know that Hisui was home to many difficult Pokemon, and powerful ones at that. With the inclusion of many others, this also meant that maybe Ursaring was struggling even with the presence of alpha Pokemon. This also did confuse many, as this didn't explain the situation with Pete, as Ursaring must have had some connection to it in order to become Ursaluna. And many were trying to hypothesize the reasons that Ursaring at all would interact with Pete. With the also known knowledge of the fact that people do have Ursaluna in the modern day to an extent, we find them in Paldea for the most part, as many trainers actually carry them as Pokemon that they use. With the discussions with those trainers, it does lead to the conclusion that many of them find Ursaluna as a whole already evolved when they catch them, because Ursaluna's ability to fight in battle is unrivaled. But we still were missing areas for the evolutionary process, as when we find the Ursalunas, they tend to be in these areas very similar to what the Crimson Mirelands would be in these swampy bog areas. But finally, scientists would have a breakthrough, as there were some elements that were long believed from legends, and they were able to take them seriously. As usually, we find the Ursalunas that randomly evolve from the scientists doing research during night skies, as they usually appear after a specific night. And one element that from the book that was able to help finally gave us the piece we needed to understand this evolutionary process, that being the full moon. Now, it was widely believed and understood that simply Pete plus an Ursaluna would not be enough to get this evolution, as many trainers had actually tried this once this study had come out, trying to give their Ursaluna blocks of Pete from areas around the Pokemon world and simply interacting with them to evolve, and it simply didn't work. However, when a scientist decided to be risky enough to try it, gave an Ursaluna the block of Pete, but tried it during the evolutionary process during a full moon. As believed in the book, the full moon must at some point awaken a power deep within Ursaring, allowing it to access even more strength. And this was exactly the case, as once it was tried, the researcher was even more amazed as the Ursaring evolved and turned into Ursaluna, proving that this evolution process worked. But it still didn't explain what its purpose was, as although Ursaluna is very much more powerful, it didn't really explain its ecological purpose and why it would evolve at all, as Ursaring itself is very strong. When we look at the area that Ursaluna used to call home, the Crimson Mirelands show us a map of a region long lost, but more importantly than that, explain some of the ecological purpose that Ursaluna may have had. As we look to the north of the Crimson Mirelands, Lake Valor's water pours through, dividing the area up, creating the swampy but also very important area that creates the home for many specific Pokemon and some of the Pokemon that are now extinct in this region, called home here. When we look at the area, we can see that the swamp and the Mirelands itself boasted very unique areas for Pokemon to interact with, as the biome was very diverse here thanks to a lot of the minerals that were here. And importantly, it also housed the pre-evolutions Ursaring and Teddiursa for Ursaluna. Now, when we look at how Ursaring and Teddiursa's evolution works, it is very important and obvious that Ursaring usually evolves into its much taller form in order to access trees, which were obviously the main source of food in the Johto region. As we can tell by the way that Ursaring and Teddiursa interact today, they use the physique of the Ursaring to usually pull down berries or fruit from trees to allow the Teddiursa's access to it, but also its strong claws and heavy physique keep it safe from predators, and its claws are good for digging into trees for pulp and into other things, but as well help it grab honey from Combi and Vespiquen, which we know are prominent in the Hisui region and the Mirelands themselves. But this also didn't mean that they were prevalent in the Mirelands. As explained in the Mirelands, from the Pokedex, it was clear that fruit trees did appear and berry trees were there, but they were not prominent all over the area. And more importantly than that, the population of Ursaring and Teddiursa must have been large, maybe even too large. It was hypothesized that maybe Ursaring, who were unable to get access to fruit trees as well as access to ample food, need to find a new way, as believe it or not, food was right underneath them. As by smelling the ground, Ursaring could probably tell that there was food underneath, and many probably began to dig for food. This was probably the first contact that Ursarings had with peat, and on the accidental night that it probably occurred, the first Ursaring had no idea that its interaction with peat on the full moon would allow it the ability to evolve into Ursaluna. As it was made obvious that Ursaluna's physique was very strange compared to Ursaring's, as going from a biped to a quadruped isn't necessarily abnormal in terms of evolution sometimes, but in the case of Ursaluna, it seemed to be an advantageous position for the area that they were from, as clearly Ursaluna's design was meant for digging into the swamps and also helping it navigate the area of the region, turning its bulky physique into a massive size to deter predators, but simultaneously allowed it to move around the area at its own pace. And although some people would say that Ursalunas lumber around the areas, they aren't that slow. And as we would look into some of the depictions left by Ursaluna, the Diamond and Pearl clans revered it as a noble Pokemon, but the Pearl clan as well as trainers would use Ursaluna as almost a type of primitive item finder. As with its great physique, but more importantly powerful claws to dig and strong scent, it was used as a way to dig into the ground. As many would see in the depictions left behind and the legends, the Ursaluna was used to dig in the ground and more importantly would find blocks of peat, which it seemed by the description of the book the trainers would use to get Ursaluna from their Ursarings. Due to the absurd sounding way to evolve Ursaring into Ursaluna, many trainers believed that this was just a hoax or maybe a joke pulled on them by friends, as Ursaluna would be known as a Pokemon meant for the daring. But due to this specific evolution, Ursaluna had massive advantages, which allowed it to coexist with both Ursaring and Teddiursa, in that Ursaluna was now an adaptive scavenger as well as an omnivore. By digging into the ground, it could find food it needed. As it could predate, it did not necessarily need to. And by coexisting, it gave its evolution line the best chance of growing. But even with this mighty ability and its capability of manipulating peat, many scientists wondered what happened to this magnificent Pokemon. As the question was asked, when did the decline start? As Ursaluna as a whole is a mystery of why it disappeared, but it's clear that the answers are already there, as we can look at the remnants of the Crimson Mirelands itself in the Great Marsh and understand probably what happened, as the Great Marsh itself is a far cry from the Crimson Mirelands, as although it's big, it is extremely tiny compared to what it once was. As we can see by the remnants of it, most of the Pokemon that were endemic to this area have now gone extinct, as some Pokemon even from other regions that were eventually brought over have adapted to living here, such as Quagsire. As by looking at the Mirelands, we can kind of understand exactly what happened, as by the time of the modern day, and even a couple hundred years ago, the buildings for Veilstone, Pastoria, and even a resort that would eventually show up in the not too distant past was beginning to appear on the Mirelands as the Mirelands got smaller and smaller. It was obvious that by humans encroaching on the territory of the swamp that they had effectively seen due to the massive population boom of Sinnoh at the time in Hisui, the Ursaluna population was forced to move elsewhere as they were losing the land that was important to them. But unfortunately for the people at the time, they couldn't have foreseen the consequences that were going to happen, as the big question that probably was asked after the disappearance of Ursaluna was, what's the worst that could happen? Now, as mentioned before, Ursaluna was viewed as a keystone species. Now, for those who don't know, I'll give a quick description. As a keystone species is a species on which other species in an ecosystem largely depend, such that if they were removed, the ecosystem would change dramatically. As many did not know that Ursaluna served a very important role in its environment, and effectively for Hisui as a whole, as with its absence disaster would strike. If you recall, I talked about how peat was important to Ursaluna's evolution, but peat serves another purpose for the environment as a whole. As with peat for the environment, it's incredibly important as it's a natural ally in the fight against climate change. As it's a rich haven for wildlife, as it improves the water quality, and helps reduce the risks of floods. Now, with the absence of Ursaluna, a few things began to change, and it would also be possible to link some of the extinctions of some of the Pokemon endemic to Hisui to the obviously absence of Ursaluna. That being first in the water quality change that would take place in the Hisui's area, as there was another Pokemon specifically that lived in Hisui at the time and was endemic to this area. However, we can kind of link its extinction to Ursaluna's absence. In that, we have Hisuian Sliggoo. As its deck entry reads, a Pokemon given to Melancholy. I suspect its metallic shell developed as a result of the mucus on its skin reacting with the iron in Hisui's water. Now, both it and eventually Hisuian Goodra were endemic effectively to the Mirelands. Although Hisuian Goodra could be found in other areas, and Sliggoo, this did not mean that they were completely independent from the abilities of what was needed in the minerals, as it was believed that due to the lack of Ursaluna tending to the peat, the mineral contents that were in the water was unable to be contained as the different salinity effectively changed, causing the water quality to disappear, and the iron that made effectively Hisuian Sliggoo so widespread in its range disappear, and could have effectively led to its extinction. Now, we also have another problem. Humans were burning peat. Now, for those who don't know, peat is full of CO2. So with it being burned, it began to rapidly accelerate the climate change already taking place in the Hisui region. Now, they unfortunately at the time probably did not know, but peat burning is very bad for the environment. And with the already changing climate for Hisui taking place, this accelerated the results as a lot of the area of the entire region began to change, not just because of human influence, but this accelerated that process. As also we would see one of the bigger problems going on would be obviously Ursaluna being pushed out of shape, as Ursaring itself was able to adapt to the change. As Teddy Ursa and Ursaring both benefited from the fact that humans began to create orchards as well as tend to Vespiquen and comb bees, as a lot of this food that the Ursaring already wanted with Teddy Ursa's was already being more widespread, so they were able to take advantage, and it kept their species existing even into modern Sinnoh. However, Ursaluna was unlucky, as with the loss of the peat that it used to call home in the form of the Mirelands, and now being forced out of its territory, it would be forced to adapt a new style. And unfortunately for Ursaluna, this could have been its death call, as after so many years, the last Ursaluna was seen, at least in the depiction, as it describes that an Ursaluna was seen walking the shores looking for food, and after that, no other Ursaluna could be found. And unfortunately for those of the Sinnoh region and Hisui too, that Ursaluna will only exist as a memory, as unfortunately, it's very hard to say if it could ever be returned into the modern Sinnoh, as all we have left now for it in its old range were the pictures left behind of it being ridden by people and the stories of legends of how it used to interact with our world. Hey you, I know you're listening. Maybe you should hit that subscribe button and join the channel. It would really help out. More importantly than that, this channel keeps you informed. So, help me out here. Hit the subscribe button. Also, let's get back to the programming. When researchers saw the picture that was given to them by the people of Kitakami, many questions were raised, as they knew, at least from what the locals had said, that this was a new form of Ursaluna, and many wanted to know what it was in terms of how this thing could be so different, and if it's an Ursaluna, why was it different than its counterparts? As, believe it or not, many scientists would be brought around, as campfire tales effectively were told to them, as they believed that this was almost impossible, but they decided to hear out anyways. As, believe it or not, they were told that from what the locals had known, that this specific Ursaluna is very old, probably dating back to when Hisui still existed. As funny enough, many tried to make the connection that this was the last Ursaluna spotted, as after it was seen on the coastline in the depictions left behind in the Pokedex, it was clear that maybe this was the last Ursaluna ever, at least in the wild of the Hisui, as it was noted that in the final time of the Ursaluna, the last few Ursalunas were forced into becoming predators in a different manner, as many were forced to find new ways of eating as the Mirelands began to disappear, and unfortunately for most, they found their effective prey, but it was a prey that was disappearing, as it was believed that the remaining Ursaluna actually hunted the white striped basculin, as due to its calmer demeanor and effectively probably the nutrition based, as Magikarp were plentiful at the time but probably didn't yield the same type of calories a burly Pokemon like this would need. They were believed to have hunted the white striped basculin for its calm demeanor, as struggling prey for this Pokemon was somewhat hard to hold in its mouth, but it was able to do so with something that was calm like the basculin. As it was also told by the people of Kitakami that the people for a long time said that this Ursaluna swam as it was found on the shore. So the legend was obviously spread that this specific Ursaluna made its way all the way from Hisui by swimming and chasing its prey, believed to chase the white striped basculin and Bascute Legion as a whole, as it followed them from Hisui as they ended up here, as it would land in the unknown area, which would have become the region of Kitakami itself. As believed by the legend says, the Ursaluna was stuck on the beach and didn't know where it was, so in order to survive, it followed its way inland, as obviously this was unknown to it. As it would have made its way into what would be known as the Timeless Woods, as many of our researchers currently were understanding that this was the area where this Pokemon was seen, so it was believed that this was its home. As unfortunately for this Ursaluna, it was in an area that was unknown to it, as many of the Pokemon here are not indicative to Hisui, so it was believed that this Ursaluna struggled to survive at first, as its home in the Timeless Woods is home to many, and I mean many, ghost Pokemon of different types, which would have given it problems, as it was believed by some of the stories that people had seen this Pokemon fight against ghost Pokemon, and it realized very soon that none of its physical attacks really had advantages against the many ghost Pokemon that take residence in the Timeless Woods. This would also mean that Ursaluna was at a bigger disadvantage because of its burly physique did not help in the tangles of the area, and as well as its ability to not see, as many of the ghost Pokemon have the ability to phase in and out of sight, which even with Ursaluna's massive smell, it did not help with the constant fog of the Timeless Woods, which allowed its scent to basically be null and void here. And with its massive claws, they served no purpose when they couldn't hit its targets, as it was recently believed, at least by scientists, that the hypothesis went like this, as the Ursaluna itself probably had to regain its bipedalism, as it was seen in the pictures, as an adaptive ability, as it decided that this was best, as it probably couldn't stand effectively, but it was able to take advantage of its abilities in terms of being able to walk, as being bipedal made it easier to track through the Timeless Woods, as unfortunately for Ursaluna, this would also come at a consequence of its power, as when we see Ursaluna's body, its body plan was never really meant to take up such weight on its back legs, so in order to become bipedal, much had to be changed, as its ability to manipulate Pete was also believed to be the case in order to help it be more effective, as many scientists began to realize that Ursaluna's Pete, at least by the depictions of the locals, it removed the Pete from its arms and hands, adding it to its face, maybe believed to be some type of counter shielding to allow it to maybe take damage from other ghosts, but also allowing its hands free, as with the heavy peat that used to cover its arms were designed more so to keep it insulated and warm as it dug through the ground, but not needing to dig anymore, Ursaluna probably removed the peat to give its hands free access to allow it to move more nimbly, even though it walks somewhat awkwardly. Now, the other issue that was hypothesized was, why on earth would Ursaluna adapt its specific blood red moon that was obviously giving its name of the blood moon beast by those of Kitakami. However, this was believed when a specific depiction of it was shown, as although the picture wasn't necessarily taken, it was drawn as a person, at least a person who said this, saw Ursaluna fire a beam from its head, specifically its red moon. This gave us the understanding that possibly this Pokemon itself has changed from a physical attacker to a special attacker, as this is not unknown by Pokemon. However, it would be the first time that it's depicted through a Pokemon that hasn't evolved in any sense by switching its physical tactics into special tactics, which is something that's only usually done by trainers. And it was also depicted that maybe Ursaluna's green eye was used almost as an effective night vision, as its reflective properties allows it to see in the night, making Ursaluna Blood Moon, as it would be called, one of the most interesting Pokemon ever to exist. As I wish I could be more concrete about Blood Moon Ursaluna itself, we don't have enough information, as pretty much most of everything that has been accumulated is from hearsay and tales. We are still in the process of trying to discover it. But with many would-be photographers trying to take pictures of it and identify the mysterious creature as it's been published in many books, there's a chance that someone one day will. But until then, this has been the story of Ursaluna, and as today's article has said, it's a tale of two bears. Now, as always, this is Brad from the Ad Army signing off, and for all of you out there, to sign on.